Well, there was a young man who was played bagpipes as a hobby, and he enjoyed doing that. And he was able to earn some extra money most of the time by doing funerals. Well, he lived in Kentucky, and one day he got a call from a funeral director out in the countryside at a little cemetery he'd never been to, and the funeral director asked him if he could come and play a few songs, including Amazing Grace, for this particular man. He said yes. Well, the thing that really struck the young man was the funeral director said, now, there are probably not going to be any friends or family. This man was homeless, and we don't know of anybody that's going to come. And yet somehow that struck the young man as even more important that he come. And so on that particular day, he drove out, but he got lost in the backcountry roads of Kentucky, didn't have GPS, and he didn't arrive to the cemetery until about an hour after the outdoor little service was supposed to start. And the hearse was gone, and the funeral director was not there. And the only thing he saw was there were a few diggers who were still there at the plot, and they were just eating their sandwiches and having lunch under the trees. And he thought, dang, maybe I should just go home. But something tugged at his heart for the homeless man that nobody would come to be with. And he thought, I'm going to play my bagpipes anyway. And so he got out of the car, and he took his bagpipes over to the plot, and he looked down inside, and sure enough, the lid of the vault was there and sealed. And he pulled out his bagpipes and began to play anyway. Well, the guys that were over here under the trees digging and eating their sandwiches put their sandwiches down, and they came and stood around and listened to him. And then he finished with his third song. He played Amazing Grace. And as he played that song, he looked up and saw that the diggers all had tears in their eyes. And some of them were beginning to weep softly. And he was so moved by that he began to weep softly as he was playing Amazing Grace. But somehow he made it through, and it was all done. And he really wasn't sure what to say. He said nothing. He just, I guess that's it. And so he got his bagpipes, and he just sort of nodded at the men and turned away and began to slowly walk back to his car. And his heart was full that he had done something, at least in thought, for the homeless man. Well, as he was slowly walking back to the car, he heard one of the diggers tell the other guys, I ain't never seen anything like that before. He said, I've been digging septic tanks for 20 years, and that's the first time I've ever seen that. Well, grace. John chapter 21 finishes with not a lesson, not a teaching lesson on grace, but several just exquisite pictures of what grace looks like and feels like and what really is. Oftentimes in our Christian life, there are times when we fail and we sort of beat ourselves up and we go, I know this in my heart, but why can't I get this down? In my head, but why can't I get this down in my heart? And sometimes that 9 or 12 inches seems like, several miles. And when I think of that, I think of, well, as people, we're different than how we think we are. We just sort of assume that because we have some truth in our mind, that should be sufficient for us. And our life is going to be different just because we know the truth. Well, there's some times where that's true, but we are more than just a mind. We are a person. And in addition to our mind, our heart also has emotions and feelings, and we are volitional creatures. We make decisions. Our lives are a storyline filled with many different stories in our past and stories yet to come. And we are filled with purpose, and there's something personal about each one of us that just didactic teaching doesn't really hit. When I was younger, a young Christian, I remember thinking, we have this thick Bible. Why, God, why didn't you just take something like the Ten Commandments and the first part of the Sermon on the Mount and just give us a Reader's Digest version of didactic teaching? What are all the things we're supposed to do? Well, of course, over time, what I've learned is that what I'm trying to explain is that we are people, and we are not just moved by didactic principles of truth, we are moved by story. Why did Jesus tell so many parables? Because story has a chance to affect our hearts like didactic teaching just can't do. And in John chapter 21, what a fitting way to end this amazing gospel, as we're going to see, through different pictures in story form of what grace looks like and feels like and seems like, in such a way that maybe grace will trickle down from our head down into our hearts. Well, the setting is the third time that Jesus appears to his disciples, and there are 7 of the guys who have gone out the night before, gone fishing, and we don't know how long they've been fishing, but they usually fished at night. And by the time that dusk comes, looking out over the eastern, over the hills on the eastern side, you can imagine the sun just barely starting to come up, and the midnight blue of the sky beginning to turn into just a soft amber color. And they're about 100 yards out, and they have caught nothing, which tells me that they went to the Seth Gatchell School of Fishing. I'm great at catching nothing when I go fish. And so you can imagine they're tired and discouraged and weary and just kind of like, when is this going to be over? We just have to call it a day. And this is where Jesus is on the shore, and we pick up our story. John chapter 21, we start with verse 4. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered, he said. He says, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Verse 7, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards away. Now, as I think about this story, and think about what was the attitude of Jesus towards these 7 disciples? Well, he calls them friends. And he sees that they haven't caught anything. He knows that. And he gives them an idea of throw the net on the right side of the boat, and they catch something. There's sort of you sort of get the sense that he's for these guys. He wants them to succeed. He sees their situation. He wants to do something about it. Now, what's the attitude of the disciples back toward Jesus? Once they see and realize it's Jesus, they can't wait to get to shore. Particularly Peter just jumps into the water and swims in. The rest of the guys have to bring the boat and the fish and all that stuff. Now, what's so striking to me about this particular episode is that these guys had colossally failed just a few weeks before. When Jesus was at his utmost, getting arrested, they fled like rats into the darkness. They knew they failed. He knew they knew they failed. He knew they failed, and he knew they knew he knew they failed. That's not easy to do. I had to practice that a while. Now, what failure reminds me of, I go back to my junior high days. Junior high in Denver was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And one of the fears that I lived with, because I was not the most upright of students when I was in junior high, I lived in fear every day of hearing over the loudspeaker for all 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, "Will Seth Gatchell please report to the vice principal's office?" Now, I lived in fear of that because back then, the vice principal had a wooden pallet, or a wooden paddle. And back then, it was okay to give students like a paddling when they needed it. And so I was always sort of pushing the limits up to that moment. I did not want to be in that situation. I usually also avoided the vice principal just in case eye contact reminded him of something stupid I had done. Now, this is the opposite here of what's going on here. They can't wait to get on shore and be in his presence. Now, why is that? Why is that? When they get there, they realize he's made them a breakfast. A little coal fire, some fish, and some bread. What image is being portrayed here? It's a picture of grace. a picture of grace. The story continues in verse 9. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to the fish, and laid some of it with, and did the same with the fish, gave them to them. Now there's a few things that are missing from this story that if we had been there and one of the disciples and realized that we had failed and he knew it, we probably would have expected this to happen. The Jesus imagined eye roll. We get to shore and Jesus goes, where he shakes his head, just kind of wags it back and forth at our failure and our futility to do what's right. He knows we failed, we know we failed, and there's the imagined eye roll of Jesus. What's also missing here is the imagined lecture. Now guys, we've been over this before, and I want you to deconstruct what happened because this cannot happen again. When I'm leaving, you cannot do this again. You know what I mean about the imagined lecture? You've played that imagined lecture in your head many times like I have. Neither the imagined eye roll nor the imagined lecture is there. In fact, what we have in the story is friends. Cast your nets on the right side of the boat. 153 fish. A breakfast prepared for them. And my favorite part of this story is the simple words, "Come, have breakfast." I mean, there's no lecture about grace? No. It's in story form. Truth in story form. Come, have breakfast. That is the point of grace. It's not the lecture, not getting it right. What he's saying to them is, I want you to sit down and enjoy company with me. And here's the shocker, and I want to enjoy your company. Story form, grace. Story, truth, grace. By the way, this picture was painted by our own Truman Pollard. Isn't that a great little picture there? Love that. He even got the 7 disciples there. You can see Peter in the water. I like that. Yeah, well done. Now, what does this say about grace? What about this story form should make it from our head to our heart? I think in our heads, we know that grace is not merit-based. We know that. We know that in our head. But that the nature of the relationship as illustrated here is this is a grace-based relationship where breakfast is more important than getting it right. Come have breakfast. Come have breakfast. Come have breakfast. Somebody wants to have breakfast with you. Now the story continues, and it takes a turn here towards Peter. Verse 15. When they had finished eating, they're sitting around there having breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, who's still sitting there, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these, more than the others who are here?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Now, I'm sure this was an embarrassing question for Peter to hear, especially in front of the other 6 disciples who were there. And yet it was a poignant question and needed to be asked because Peter had not too much before had declared his devotion that even if all these other losers fall away, he won't. In Matthew 26:33, here's what he had said. "Lord, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away from you." Well, and certainly he did fall away. Now, why did Jesus bring this up in front of the other 6 disciples? because Jesus' sin had not just been against God, the sin of pride, but it had also been sin against the other disciples. Sort of the sin of comparison and contempt, that sort of superior, you guys may not make it, but I've got the stuff that I'm going to make it through here. And so when Peter comes through to a time of confession, the scope of the confession matches the scope of the offense to the other disciples. That's sort of one thing to pick up from this story, but there's something even deeper going on than this. Comparison is one of those things that I have lived with all my life and I continue to deal with. Thankfully, getting older sort of helps to realize, well, that's stupid. And that's slowly becoming more a part of who I am. But comparison is not just a solo sin here. People pick up when we are comparing, or they pick up our pride, and it just sort of goes out. The effects of this just sort of have like a pebble in a little pond, and the waves just slowly pick it up. If you're in the work world, there's a lot of work worlds where this comparison and this competition is going on, and people end up kind of looking over their shoulder to make sure that nobody's putting them down or making them look bad. Because if you get dropped down a peg, somebody else is going to get pushed up a peg. Pride can be very subtle, but it can also sabotage the relationships in the work world. It can also sabotage relationships here among the disciples. James and John had been comparing and looking to kind of get above. Jesus, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand when you come in your kingdom? James 3:16 says, where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. 2 Corinthians 10:12, we do not dare to class or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. Now, thankfully, the conversation doesn't end here. It's just really beginning with Peter and Jesus, and it was with a higher purpose in mind. Now, as we look back at this passage, Lance read, and we just read a moment ago, in your handout, I have the same verses, but you'll see that there are 6 words for love that Jesus is going to use here that are translated love in English, but 2 of them have the word agape, which is a Greek word for sacrificial love, and 4 of the words have the word phileo, which is friendly, brotherly love. And to sort of help, if you have an outline or you're watching this from home, the ones that are capitalized is the word agape, and the ones in small case is phileo. Well, let's look at this again, verse 15. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? There's the agape word, the sacrificial God kind of love. He says, Peter, do you love me like that? More than these? And yes, Lord, Peter says. And I can imagine there's sort of a little lump in the throat and kind of a gulp. His response is, you know that I love you, but he doesn't use the word agape. He uses the word phileo. And it's almost as if he has seen, I have the sentiment of wanting to love like that. But I have the reality of just being on the phileo side. Now, I give him points for having the sentiment to love like that. That's important to God. But what he realizes here is that I'm just not there yet. But there's something in here, the sentiment says, but I want to be. And then, even after he's had this lump in his throat, the next thing that Jesus says to him must have just stunned him. He says, feed my lambs. If I had been Peter, I would have said, no, I don't qualify. And what Jesus would have said is, yes, you do. And on what basis would that have been true? And then the next thing happens. Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he uses that same word agape. He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Peter responds with the phileo word. And again, I can just hear something in Peter going, I know I don't qualify. And Jesus saying, yes, you do. Yes, you do. And then the third time, verse 17, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And this time, Jesus doesn't use agape. He reaches down for that phileo word. And you can almost hear Peter hearing, do you even brotherly love me? And Peter was hurt, the scripture says, because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. He used the word phileo. And I can just imagine Peter just sort of being deflated each time. Down, down, down. You know, I must be a spiritual loser. And yet, the third time, Jesus says, again, feed my sheep. And I would want to say, I don't qualify. Don't you hear me? I'm not your guy. I utterly failed. He said, I know that. Feed my sheep. Now, when I think about this, I think, you know, we sort of live on that merit-based thing, that's what's important. The grade card. I went to seminary. Check. Or if I didn't go to seminary, I've been on a couple mission trips and really helped some people around the world. Check. That qualifies me. Or I've been a Christian for X amount of years. Check. Or I've been an elder or a Bible study group leader, or I've led in some ministry, or I've led in worship. We sort of have these things that qualify us. And here, Jesus is turning that completely upside down. Now, what in the world qualifies Peter to feed my sheep 3 times? It is his humble brokenness about his failure that says, you're the guy. Now, there are times in the course of my life where as a pastor, I've wanted to be the answer man, the Bible expert. And there's a place for wisdom and truth, and there's a place for knowing the Bible well, obviously. But that's not what encourages people. People get discouraged if they think you have it all together. What gives them hope is if they resonate with you, that they struggle with the same kinds of things you struggle with, and yet you keep going on with Jesus, and the effect is, well, maybe I can too. And to that, Jesus says, that's what we're looking for. That's what we need here. It's another picture, story, truth of what grace looks like. And then we finish with the last little great story here I love, verse 18. At this point, Peter gets up. And Jesus, I think, motioned for him to come. And he wants to have a private conversation with him. And John stands up and is sort of walking in the shadows as they're walking along the beach. Very truly, Jesus says, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. Now he's talking about Peter's future. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Verse 20, Peter turned and saw that the disciple John, whom Jesus loved, was following him, the same one who had leaned back against Jesus at the Last Supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And I love this little story because one of the reasons why is because Jesus had just confronted him about comparison. And he got the message in his head. And yet, here he is right again at the very next opportunity to not compare, and his mind goes there instantly. Boom. What about him? Now, if you think about this, I relate to this. It's sort of like there's something not fair about this. You mean I'm going to die on a cross? Are we all going to have to do this? What about John? And when I think of this, I think about, we're sort of like the whack-a-mole of sin. You know, we have that one thing where we deal with comparison, we put the mallet to it and it's down and it pops up again just like here. And this is kind of instructive to me about sin because sometimes sin is not a conscious decision, but sin is so embedded in our nature that it just pops up like the next whack-a-mole. And there it is. And we're surprised that this happens. What about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Now, the word there, want, the Greek verb, is thelo, and what it means, it can be translated what I wish, or what I will, or what I determine, or what I want, which is what the NIV did here, or my decision is. We would call this, he's talking about God's will. If it's my will that John continue on until I come back, is the idea. He says, what is that to you? That's a rhetorical question. What is that to you? And where does your mind go with that? Well, I think about, my mind goes to, Peter, you're skating on thin ice. This is not ice that's good for you to be skating on. And if you continue to let your mind go in this direction, you're going to find yourself swimming in some very cold water. Not a good idea. Or the second thing I think about is sort of like a stop sign that Jesus is putting up in front of him. What is that to you? And here I think about, what's he saying to him? He's saying something about the mystery of the larger story of life that we all go through. Some of us have a story where we're going to be crucified like Peter. Some are going to be in exile like John. And this is where sort of the mystery of the larger story, which we've been talking about, is personalized to every individual person. What are your particular strengths and weaknesses? What are your particular gifts and abilities? What are the stories that make up your particular past? What are the things that make up your experiences with pain or failure? And all of these things, it's like God takes and wraps them all up together in what we're calling the larger story in your distinctive life. And there's a storyline here, a meta-narrative of building Christ-likeness in his children. And all of these things are important. And what Jesus is saying to Peter is, let me take care of that part. Let me do that. I think the third reason he asks this question here is he's saying something to hear of, Peter, if you follow why that's important to you, you're going to find yourself at the point of pride. So if you want to think about that, you can. And there are times when that's an important thing to do. But then the final answer, it's not a rhetorical question. He says, here's what you should think about. Follow me. Follow me. These disciples all began the trek of following Jesus based on that particular command. Follow me. Matthew 4:19. Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And all along the way, Luke 14, if anyone comes to me, and Luke 14, 26, 27, 33, there's the follow me. And here at the very end, just before Jesus leaves, it's the same command. Follow me. Well, that's John 21. And this is almost how it ends. I'll let you read the last few verses on your own, maybe this afternoon. I used to think John 21 was sort of anticlimactic, and I guess it kind of is related to the cross and resurrection. I mean, what's going to beat that? And yet, as I think about John 21, what better way to finish the theological, didactic truths of the crucifixion and the resurrection with some story truth about grace. Friends, one of the things we saw. Cast your nets on the right side of the boat. A picture of grace. Breakfast that's been prepared. Picture of grace. Peter swimming wildly to the shore as quickly as he can. He understands grace. But my favorite one in the chapter is come have breakfast. Come have breakfast. It's an invitation not just to the disciples, not just to me, but it's an invitation to you too. Come have breakfast. I want to enjoy your company. And I want you to enjoy my company as well. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for this chapter. I've never been so grateful as I have the last few weeks for this chapter. For years and years, a lot of us could utter, oh, I know what grace is. G-R-A-C-E, God's riches at Christ's expense. Check. Oh, I know what grace is. Undeserved love for the undeserving. Check. Unmerited favor. Check. But we usually don't go to things as simple as friends or come have breakfast. May we see you, God, and the enjoyment that you have for your children, and your delight and hope that we will also enjoy company with you and with one another in the realm of joy that you can find nowhere else except in your presence. Would you take these pictures, story truth, and sear them into our hearts? Come, have breakfast.